Hi everyone, this is Jason from Heights Archery, and today I'm here to give you guys some tips on things you can do with your bow to get it ready and set up for season. Season's opening up here right away, and I'm going to go over a few things that I do with my own equipment to get my bow and my arrows and everything tuned up so that I have that confidence in the field when I head out. We want to go over a few things on the bow maintenance-wise. After we've been shooting all summer, putting a lot of arrows downrange, there tends to be sometimes vibration and stuff that comes through with the bolts. Particularly in your cams and your sight and your rest. We want to go over that stuff and make sure it's all tight. So I'll just take out a set of my Allen keys and I'll just go over all the screws and the mods, make sure they're tightened down. Especially if you've been hearing any vibration when you're shooting, you hear a rattle when you're shooting in your practice time. You want to make sure that you go over and check that all those bolts are tight because you don't want those coming loose on you in the field. The most important part of our bow and arrow system is our strings and cables. That's what holds everything together. And if they're not perfect, then nothing else in the bow is really going to matter that much for you. What we want to do is make sure that we're changing them regularly. So my recommendation would be every 2 to 3 years, and that we're also doing waxing and cleaning of the strings after and before each season to make sure that we're keeping dirt and stuff out of there and the strings are not getting dried out. The best thing to do when it comes to waxing is get yourself a good stick of wax and a piece of leather, and we're going to work a little bit of light wax onto the exposed strands of the string. Not over the serving parts necessarily, but anywhere that the strands of the string with the fibers are there. And just a little bit of light wax on each of those parts, and we'll take our piece of leather and we're just going to rub that and work it in the string so that heats that wax into the string so it melts in there good and it's not having a bunch of sticky wax on the outside that's going to collect a bunch of dirt. And I like to do this right before season starts and right after I've done a good thorough string cleaning. And that just helps keep our strings preserved after we've been dragging our bow through the dust and the dirt for 3 months during the fall. What I would recommend doing once you have your bow set up and tuned in the way that you want and it feels comfortable and everything's flying straight, is to actually take some measurements on the bow so you have some points of reference if things start changing and you're losing accuracy or your impact points changing all of a sudden. A couple of things that I like to measure is the distance between our knock point here, which is where you knock the arrow, and the center of the peep sight. And in my case, I'll be using this nose button, which is an anchor point for my nose when I'm shooting. And I want to know what all these measurements are, so if something slides or moves throughout the season or during practice and I'm losing accuracy or something doesn't feel right, I can go back to those measurements later as a point of reference to make sure that everything's where it should be when the bow is shooting its best. Having those measurements down allows you to eliminate any issues that you might have or try to fix later on because you're trying to tune problems that maybe aren't there when it's just something that moved. Another good measurement to take is the axle to axle length, which is the distance between the axle on this limb and that limb, to know if your strings or cables have been stretching. Again, this can be prevented when you're replacing your strings regularly and making sure you're buying good aftermarket strings that'll keep your bow system together and solid. So some things I want to look at here now is, before I start actually setting up and tuning my broadheads and making sure that they're flying correctly, is that the bow's preliminary setup is where it should be and nothing else has moved. So here I'm putting levels on the string to make sure that the arrow is level with the bowstring, so that the arrow is leaving on a perfect 90 and is going to give us the best flight possible, at least as a starting point when we start to set up our bow and do our setting and adjusting and making adjustments to get our broadhead straight. The next thing I'm also going to check is what we call center shot, which is basically the horizontal distance from the inside of the bow handle or the riser to the middle of the arrow. And I want to check to make sure that that looks like it's running pretty much straight up and down with the bow when the arrow's set in the center there. So everything looks pretty good here. And now from this point, we can begin to take the bow on the range, do kind of a quick sight in and move to broadhead tuning. But before we actually do that, we want to check and make sure that our arrows are 100% built correctly and that they're going to be the optimal size for us. So hopefully by now you've had your bow draw length and draw weight set to where they're comfortable and correct positions for you. And if you need any more advice on that, there's lots of good information out there about how to properly measure draw length, The way that we do it here in the store is by measuring the person's wingspan at a fairly relaxed state and dividing that number by 2.5. The thing to keep in mind is each bow company's draw lengths are measured slightly differently, and not one company's length will be the exact same measurement another company's length. So it's good to have those things custom fitted by somebody at a pro shop who knows how to judge your form and size and can make those slight adjustments for you so that it's the perfect fit. Just like shoes or anything else, it needs to be fit exactly correctly to you. After we have those parts figured out, your draw weight and your draw length, and things are set comfortably, we need to make sure that we're choosing the right and correct size of arrow for the bow that you're going to be shooting. Now, the most important number and thing when choosing arrows is the spine of the arrow, or the stiffness of the arrow. And that's basically a number that indicates how much flex it has. That number is important when it comes to tuning the bow, because arrows do need to bend a certain amount when they come off the bowstring to fly and tune correctly so that your broadheads have good flight and impact correctly downrange. The way that that's done, and there's a lot of spine charts and stuff online from different manufacturers and different programs out there on the internet that you can plug in kind of the data that you need to figure out which size of arrow is correct for you. But it's important that you know how long you want to cut the arrow, which is usually based very closely on your draw length, the correct draw weight that you're going to be shooting, things like how heavy your broadheads are going to be, to figure out what size is perfect for you. And once you have those numbers dialed in, you could begin going to broadhead tuning of the bow, which is what we do to make sure that your broadheads are flying as straight and as correctly as possible, and grouping with your field points so that they're impacting your target downrange in the most effective and lethal way possible. So now that we're confident in our bow set up and we've selected the right arrows, the next thing we want to choose is the correct broadhead for what we're using. And broadheads, there are many different styles and shapes, but they can really be broken down into two main categories, which would be fixed blade broadheads and expandable or mechanical broadheads. And each has their advantages and disadvantages, and some are better for certain situations than others. If you are shooting a heavier poundage bow with a lot of power, especially at lighter skin game like deer and even bears, an expandable generally will work pretty well. They cut big holes, and another main advantage for them is that they are very narrow in profile, so that they don't have as much effect flying down the range and changing, affecting the trajectory of the arrow or the impact point of the arrow. When you have a fixed blade broadhead, because those blades are large outside, they're grabbing air when they come off the bowstring, and they tend to want to steer the arrow in one direction or the other. And if your bow is not tuned perfectly, or you have even problems with your shooting form like bow torquing, then they can impact off of where your field points, which can be a pretty frustrating situation when you're trying to get those things to come together. I would definitely recommend fixed blade broadheads, especially a cut-on contact style like this one, if you're shooting lighter poundage with a shorter draw length, or if you're going after larger game like elk or moose. They tend to have better penetrating power. They're generally smaller in cutting diameter, but if you run into things like hitting bones or ribs on a large size animal like that, they're going to give you that extra punch you need to get through the other side and make sure that you're making a lethal and fatal shot on that animal. And a really important thing to keep in mind is after you've built your arrows, generally they're going to come with field points or practice tips on them. Now, you want to make sure that when you're choosing a broadhead, it's the same weight as your field points, so that you're going to be building that arrow as close and as consistent as possible with the arrow that you're going to hunt with. That starting point will give you a lot better place to begin when it comes to tuning and making sure that things are going to fly straight. Having different weights of points affects how the arrow comes off of the bowstring, so we want to make sure that those are as close and consistent as possible. So always match your broadheads to the weight of your field points. That way you're going to be building an arrow that's as consistent as your practice arrows.